Today, we are going to talk about talent optimization. Today's workplaces are changing at a rapid pace, and HR is on the hot seat to keep companies productive and the employees aligned to the company strategy. Finding the right people for the right roles, especially your next-gen leaders, is critical to your ongoing success. To help you do this with confidence, we've called in the Godfather of Talent Optimization, Dr. Matt Poepsel, Vice President at the Predictive Index. Matt Poepsel helps leaders at every level, from HR leaders to executives to team leaders, realize their true potential. For the last 10 years, he's been Vice President of Professional Services at the Predictive Index, which specializes in pre-employment testing that helps companies understand how their people think and work. Matt is also the host of Lead the People podcast and is a keynote speaker on the topics of talent strategy, talent management, team dynamics, leadership development, employee engagement, organizational culture, performance psychology, and productivity. During his early career, Matt was a sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps, where he served our country as an Arabic linguist and performed radio reconnaissance. You can purchase his recently published leadership book titled Expand the Circle on Amazon. Matt, welcome to Voices of HR.
Thank you so much for having me, Berta. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, well, we are so excited to have you here. So we have had a couple of different conversations in the past. I've sat on one of your panels, and I might have a little part in your book. Can you show? I forgot my copy today. There it is.
I got a little flag right here where you appear. All about HR leaders. I love it.
It is all about HR leaders. And thank you for dedicating a portion of your book to HR, who have an incredibly difficult job these days. So we were introduced by a mutual friend, John Saunders, and I don't know if I ever heard the backstory, though. Can you tell our listeners where this Godfather of Talent Optimization, dun, 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 came from?
Yeah, the year was about 2018, and I was part of an organization here at the Predictive Index, and we were talking about how our clients we've had since 1955, when the company first started, were struggling to really apply the best practices and all the things that we would have for them. And so decided to create a new discipline, all called talent optimization. It's really all about aligning talent strategy with people strategy and all these kinds of things. And that was important, and we wanted to bring a lot of attention to it. And as I started looking at it, I thought, man, this is the first discipline I've ever seen that really puts equal emphasis on the business part and the people part all at the same time. And it's very common now, as I've come to experience, to see as much as a 10 times return on any sort of investment you might make in talent optimization. So for me, that became an offer I couldn't refuse. That's how the Godfather moniker kind of stuck when I started to really embrace it and utilize it a little bit more. People really thought, yeah, it's time to get some attention to this thing, and let's lean into it. So I said, okay, here we go.
Well, I love it. I love it. I think it's unique, and it is incredibly true too. And so we're going to talk here in a little bit about talent optimization and how the Predictive Index and the tests that you administer work. I'm a huge fan. I've used them both as a coach and in my first role as a C-suite executive. I took the test, and so we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But I also wanted you to share with our listeners about your career journey, because I think it's always important for any executive or any individual who wants to be a great leader to think about deploying their talent and their skills and their experience in different ways within their organization, especially if they want to have strategic impact or if they want to continue to ascend in their organization. So you have been in the military, URA, right? The Marines. You are a vice president, and you are now an author. So tell us about how all this happened and what your journey was.
Yeah, I had an inauspicious beginning. I was in college and freshman year, I turned in a 0.7 GPA. That's not very good. University sent me a letter saying, don't hurry back. So I kind of ran out of options in my life. And I had always thought about, back in my mind, joining the service and the Marine Corps specifically from a very young age. I was actually in an ROTC program in college. I liked the military part. I just wasn't really ready to be in school at that point. So for me, enlisting in the Marine Corps and finishing that off became really, really important. And so when I got to the service, they taught us the priorities in a very specific order. Number one, mission accomplishment. Number two, troop welfare. Number one was going to happen. Number two, it's nice if it happens. And so for 6 years, I served in the Marine Corps with that sort of philosophy. It's not that we don't take care of our Marines, but I think that it really is mission driven more than anything else. And I came to experience that myself. And so when I decided that I kind of was tired of looking to read in the newspaper if I was going to get promoted or not, there wasn't much room for individual advancement, and certainly as an enlisted person. So I decided to get out and to go into civilian life. Well, I thought, the Marines had prepared me well for leadership. So I started showing up in the civilian world with that mentality of mission accomplishment over troop welfare, the equivalent in the civilian world. That didn't work at all. It just did not translate.
Really?
Yeah. People were not going to just be pushed around that way, or you can't be that direct with people. And I think I didn't really understand two things. One is that the military, the Marine Corps specifically, invests so heavily in leadership development because they have to grow leaders from within. I thought that's just what adults did. So when I went to the civilian world, I'm like, let's do more leadership development. They're like, what are you talking about? Like, that's not a thing we do. I'm like, what? That was one problem. And the other was that there's such a why wired into military service. You're here to serve your country. You're here to, to protect the nation. If you go become an accountant in an accounting firm, like, you don't have that anymore. There's not the same emphasis on the bigger picture. So I think that those were two big adjustments for me when I was a first-time leader in the civilian ranks.
And we're going to talk about your book here in a little bit, because I do think anytime someone has a journey through leadership, that there are so many important lessons. And I'm so grateful that you put all of those bound into a book for our audience and for anyone who gets to read them. But so now take us on through the journey of, you're now the vice president at the Predictive Index. So obviously you took this whole notion of leadership seriously and really wanted to kind of cultivate optimization. As I said before, I am a huge fan of not only the concept of talent optimization, because I think that whole concept can be leveraged in so many different ways, and we're going to talk about that. But I'm also a huge fan of the PI test and the PI cognitive test. And the reason is, I alluded to this, my first C-suite job, the specific company leveraged both of those tests, and they work. And the reason I know they work is because once I got hired into that organization, everybody that I worked with was smart and talented and driven. We all were kind of cut from the same cloth that was absolutely necessary to drive the organization forward and drive profit for that point in their life cycle. So will you help us understand a little bit more about the Predictive Index, the tests, and what's really the science behind it, and how does it optimize teams?
Yeah, I'll tell you that when I was first exposed to the Predictive Index tools like you were, it was before I was in the company. I was working for a small software startup, and I was very interested in getting the people part right because, to be honest with you, Bert, I was terrible at it. I was just not having the success that I wanted. I wasn't showing up in terms of being a leader the way that I wanted. And I didn't recognize that I was doing everything by gut. And it wasn't until I ended up in a situation where we had hit some hard times. This was during the housing bubble burst, and we had to make some cuts. And I ended up having to let somebody go who I myself had hired because they weren't a great fit for the role. And that was on me. And I thought, man, I just don't know what I'm doing here. Like, I don't have, everywhere else I look, I was a software product person at the time. And I'm like, I have data on everything except my people. And so when I was introduced to the Predictive Index, here comes an assessment that gives us data, but also gives us insights into how people are wired so we can understand how to match them to jobs and coach and develop them in these things. And I took to it so fast because I knew we could crack the code on these things if we use the tools. And I was just so happy to have them. Fast forward to 2013, I joined the company and had a chance to run product for them. And so building software, but this time to make the same epiphany I was brought to, and the experience you had as well, trying to make that even more accessible for people around the world. And that was really a great opportunity. And so, to answer your question about the science, the Predictive Index Behavioral Assessment is the flagship offering, and it really basically takes less than 7 minutes to complete, but it presents the employee or the candidate with just a simple inventory of items that we interact with and say, like, this is about me. Let me tell you all about myself, or let me tell you what others expect of me, or whatever the question might be. And what it tells us is about what drives you, what accounts for your behavior. So someone like myself has an extremely strong drive for extroversion. I want to work with and through other people almost exclusively. And that's important to know about me. Yeah. And so that's kind of the area where it begins.
And that's interesting because I always talk about ambition and drive. That internal compass is really such a key indicator of someone being successful. Because if I see so often people are in positions and they've got themselves there, right? They've worked hard, they've gotten their promotions, they're sitting in these key executive positions, but they're not happy. And they don't want to come to work every day because they're just not filling their gas tank. And a lot of it comes because the intrinsic motivation, it's there, but it just wants to be deployed in a different way.
Yeah.
So your test focuses and helps illuminate what drives someone.
And in many cases, it's a surprise to themselves when they say, oh, this explains so much. How can you know so much from such a simple assessment? And the reality is that self-awareness is hard to come by, especially earlier in our careers. So you have two choices. If you're a manager, you can either take months and months spending time with your people and trying to guess and figure it out, or you can use an assessment like the Predictive Index, and you can fast forward that process and understand specifically how you need to adapt your leadership style to match and meet their needs. And then everything flows in the business that much faster and that much more smoothly.
So true. So talk to us a little bit about, so if I'm a leader and I have these test results for the people on my team, where does the optimization come in?
Yeah, the first question, and the one I get asked almost all the time, is what is it exactly that we're optimizing?
Yeah.
And so there's two things. One is performance and the other is experience. When you think about the performance of an individual, of a team of people, of the entire organization, that kind of equates to a little bit to what I was saying earlier about the Marine Corps and mission accomplishment. And so if we don't have high performance, then we're not getting the job done. We need to get something addressed. The other is experience. If the employees aren't having a good experience, either maybe there's two people who aren't getting along, they're having conflict, or maybe it's an entire group where the team is just having a dysfunction or maybe a struggle in some way, they're not having a great experience. That creates a certain problem too, right? Because then people aren't as ready to bring in their discretionary effort. They're more likely to turn over. They're more likely to cause counterproductive behaviors and these sorts of things. So in terms of what is it we're trying to optimize, it's the performance and experience of every employee, every pair of employees, every team in the entire building, right? Virtual or otherwise. And so that really becomes the objective of saying, how do we make sure everyone's having the highest level possible of those two things? And where the assessments bring awareness, which leads to insight. Oh, I understand now, which leads to action. What can I do differently knowing what I now know about this team, about this goal, about this person, the combination of these complex things inside of an organization? It really accelerates that process.
So that makes me think about DE&I. And, that has really been a strategic agenda, I would say, over the last 2 to 3 years, really has accelerated to the top of strategic initiatives in most organizations. I think now, I just read the other day that a third of CEOs are really pulling back and taking it off of the priority list in 2023 and into 2024. And that scares me a little bit only because we can't let our foot off the gas pedal. But yet I also don't think that we've always been thinking about DE&I as talent optimization. So how does it DE&I fit into talent optimization?
Yeah, I think they go hand in hand. And I think that it's an unusual way of looking at it. Most of the time when we think about performance or experience, we don't make that connection that you're making. And so I think it's really short-sighted if we pull back from DEI initiatives because we're not done yet. There won't be really a
Yeah.
done. But when we start to think about it, what can happen sometimes is we can ascribe cultural differences that are actually personality differences. And so this is where we start to understand how behavioral assessments can help us understand how to provide more balance across a team. For example, if you have sort of homogeneity for one type of personality, for example, then there's a tremendous overuse strength likelihood because we don't
Mm-hmm.
have diversity of thought. We don't have diversity of behavior. That can be a problem. More traditional forms of diversity and equity and these sorts of things too really are being extended now. We're starting to see this intersectionality that can happen when we start to combine not just gender differences, but what about gender and non-gender differences along with ethnicity? You can create these very specific, everyone is having a very individualized experience at work. And we
Mm-hmm.
have to understand and educate our leaders and managers and leaders at every level. How do I start to understand and be empathetic towards those things? And I think those are areas that get us back toward that type of optimization as well. And then finally, when we think about things like neurodiversity or we think about personality differences in remote and hybrid environments,
Mm-hmm.
it's all in there. It's all in there. So if we're going to be working together at our best, we've got to embrace diversity, not move away from it, especially in a future that's going to demand higher levels of innovation and creativity and productivity than ever in the future. You're not going to get that if everyone is the same or everyone's pretending like we can't accommodate differences. It's just not going to happen.
I agree. I agree. And, in fact, I was talking the other day with an executive and I said, please do not pull your foot off the gas pedal because it will come back in 3 to 5 years. It will. Because the companies who are not letting up on it are going to figure out how to optimize their talent. And to your point, there's certain skill sets that are emerging post pandemic that executives need to have that don't have today. So if you think about optimizing these teams, is there any particular skill sets or experiences that optimized teams have that maybe others don't?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see anything in the data that could help people understand, help our HR pros understand what these optimized teams look like?
I think about it from an outside in perspective. The most superficial thing that you hear about or read about today, if you rip the headlines, it's all about technology, right? Technical skills, analytic skills, chat GPT is all you hear about. It's
Yeah,
very superficial though, when you
so
think
true.
about it. If we keep going a little bit further into the organization, a little deeper, the reality is human skills. And they're in short
Mhm.
supply in many organizations. When you look and you ask people, especially like early up and coming career people, what is it that you want? They want coaching, development, they want affiliation,
Mhm.
they want to be
They do.
nurtured, they want high levels of empathy from their managers and understanding. And so these are the human skills that leaders of the future have to not look at as vulnerabilities and weaknesses and soft.
Mm.
They are competitive differentiators, they are essential. If we go even a little bit further inward, I would say that flexibility and change. The reality is that there is no static business environment. It never was true, but it's certainly
Mhm.
not true moving forward. An organization that's wired for change is going to be able to take advantage of shifts in the marketplace or from inside that much faster and that much easier. And that is going to be a competitive differentiator too. So I would say that, superficially, probably the least interesting that we're all talking about right now is technical skills.
Mhm.
But I think human skills and the psychological flexibility, wiring that into an organization and its people, that's a huge skill right there. And not everybody has it.
It's so true. And we had the CEO of the Muse, Catherine Minshew, on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. And she talked about a study that they had around Gen Z and about how they are voting with their feet if they encounter what she termed shift shock, which is the company is telling them one thing during the interview phase, and then once they enter the company, once they're hired, they're experiencing something completely different. And most often it's toxicity.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And that's something that this generation just is not going to tolerate.
No.
They're not going to give up that part of their energy to a company that cannot kind of love them back.
Yeah.
So I found that incredibly interesting.
Well, first of all, how great is the Muse? Oh my gosh, what an amazing resource. I remember when I first saw the Shift
Isn't
Shock
it?
statistics coming out, and I
Yeah.
thought, you know what's happening is that it's not seen as a pejorative by Gen Z to move around. If they say, look, I was
Mhm.
6 months at that company, and it turned out it was a toxic environment, so I left,
Mhm.
they don't care. And the reality is that the
No,
job
they don't.
market is so tight for very specialized skills that the employers don't care either. So now there's no impunity to the old classic job hopping. You look at the resume, oh, look at all these short
Mhm.
stints. They're job hoppers. Not anymore. You know, you're lucky to
Mhm.
get the talent to do some of these jobs at all. There's so much underemployment in certain sectors. That's one thing. And the second is that when you start looking at the nature of Gen Z and wanting to move around and go to places where they're going to experience that coaching and that development, that growth,
Mhm.
if they're not going to get that and it's a toxic environment, they'll drop out of the workforce traditionally completely and just do gig work. Gig work
Mhm.
right now is exploding, Uber drivers and all that kind of stuff. I've
Mhm.
talked to so many people who have gig jobs and they say, I tried corporate, it didn't work. I'm like, oh my
Mhm.
gosh, what do you mean you
Mhm.
tried corporate, it didn't work? And they're like,
Yeah.
no, it's just not worth it. I don't have to
Yeah.
do that anymore. So they have choices. And I think that organizations now are starting to wake up and realize, like, oh my gosh, this is actually hurting our long-term productivity if we can't
Mhm.
make these people happy.
Yeah. Turnover is expensive, whether it's entry level or mid level, senior level. You just can't have that kind of turnover, you know?
Yeah.
Um, so let's talk a little bit about the executive level.
Mhm.
And obviously, there's also been a lot of change. And you spoke about this just very briefly. The markets have changed. There's globalization, there's acceleration in technology. What are you seeing when it comes to executive skills or experiences that are getting a premium or are needed in the future for an executive to be successful?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's a little bit newer is this willingness to accommodate multiple stakeholders. So
Mm,
the days of the executive who's only serving the bottom line are coming. I don't want to say they're coming to an end, but they're certainly falling out of favor. So when you start to think about how are we actually making our society better? How are we making our community stronger? How are we
mhm.
healing the planet through sustainability efforts? You know, in some cases, companies are being dragged kicking and screaming to these conclusions because
Yeah.
consumers are demanding it, voting with their
Mhm,
wallets. And now the employees are demanding it because they're saying, you know, we want you to be good stewards. If you're known as a bad actor and,
mhm.
and you have an employee, a young employee who goes to a party and says, oh, I work at so-and-so. And they're like, ooh, you work at that place? They won't be working there for long. And
Mhm.
so it's like now when the consumers are demanding high levels of this, we'll call it conscious capitalism, then the same is true for when the employee side also has choices. So I think that an executive who's like, we're all about maximizing profit, bottom line, me, all the time. Like,
Mhm.
no, that's not working anymore for sure.
Mhm.
The other is a recognition that most executives in the average company are going to be either boomers or they're going to be Gen X like myself.
Mhm.
And the way that the experiences we had and what we were told and shown as to what it takes to get to those high ranks
Mhm.
are not the same path that young people who are coming into the organization now are going to need to follow to get to the same place.
Mhm.
And I talked to so many executives who are like, well, if they don't grind, if they don't do 80 hours a week like I did, how do they think they're going to get to where I am? And I
Right.
said, they've seen where you are and they don't want it.
That's
They,
right.
they don't want to be estranged from their families and look like hell the way you look terrible.
Yeah,
Take care of yourself. Like
exactly.
they've seen that movie. They don't want that. And they're like,
It's done.
oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
So I think that the awareness of an executive to say, my mindset and my worldview was shaped by people who are long gone from the workplace.
Mhm.
What workplace do I need to create for my future leaders? And
Mhm.
have the courage and the willingness to build that for them.
Yes. And not impose on them what was successful for our generation, to your point, because I see that with women as well. A lot of them look up and they see the sacrifices that executive women had to make on their path or their ascension into the C suite or senior executive levels. And a lot of them say, I don't want it. I don't want to, not go to attend my child's school event or be late for their birthday party because I had a client call. They're just not willing to sacrifice that. And I think our generation needs to accept it. and they need to figure out how to embrace it. And I think that's why I love Gen Z, is because they are coming in and they're saying, this is how it's going to be. We're going to make up 25% of the workforce by 2025, and we're going to have some real power.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and I remember when the millennials began to come into the workplace, they said, we want to be heard. And we were
Yeah.
like, what? Really?
Yes.
Why? Gen Z comes in and says, not only do we want to be heard, we want you to make some changes around here. And we're like, what?
Yes.
Really? Why?
Yeah.
Where's this going to stop? And I liked it when I'm giving talks, I like to have people in the audience raise their hand. I say, how many of you got a 10 to 13-year-old at home? This is Generation Alpha, right? The first generation that was born exclusively in this new millennium of ours. And I mean, oh my gosh, you want to talk about the level of technical savvy, agency. It's going to be the most demanding generation ever to enter the workforce, and it's only going to continue. So I think that, by future-proofing your organization, by learning to really, of course, we're going to accomplish the mission, but we're going to do it in a way that meets our people where they are. We've talked about women, we've talked about Gen Z. If we can learn how to do that and flex our organizations, then we can accommodate the future high performers that are sitting in Gen Alpha right now. However they're going to school and all the experiences they're having, they're going to bring those to the workforce soon enough. So why not develop resilience and flexibility into our workplaces so we can play the long game and not just, chase very short-term outdated modes of what boomers and Gen X used to, subject themselves to in order to get to the top.
Yeah. Yesterday I had a call with a CHRO of an organization, and she's gonna pop on the podcast here in a couple of weeks. And she was so refreshing because she is displaying exactly what you're talking about. She's embracing the fact that this is a whole new generation, that the workplace is changing, and that the C-suite has to change as well. And she was definitely an advocate and a champion of that. And so I cannot wait to have her on. She's talk about shaking things up. She can shake it up.
I say it too, Berta. I say, I love where Gen Z is leading us because the level of inclusivity, the nature of the care that they have about things that are beyond just the organization are actually really good for organizations. But we also have to acknowledge they're bringing the highest levels of anxiety and stress and pressure that we've ever seen.
Yeah.
And I cannot imagine for a generation that has never known safety, who, post 9/11, post school violence, post global pandemic, I mean, they can't catch a break. And now all of a sudden I'm seeing the mental health toll entering the workforce. And we're like still of a mindset in most organizations that it's taboo to talk about mental health.
Right.
Unacceptable. We've got to fix that. You can't have a kid who is in college talking about not just their mental health challenges, but also what medications they were on in their dosages, and then come to work 2 weeks later and be like, we don't talk about any of this stuff here. You're like, what are we going to just pretend like this isn't happening? Like, no, absolutely not. So I think we have to change, and good for that CHRO of being that breath of fresh air on your show. I can't wait to hear, because we've got to make changes. It's just not going to work otherwise. In either mission accomplishment, your business performance will suffer, or worse yet, in my opinion, troop welfare, the equivalent of that, the people's welfare, mentally, what they take home with them after coming to my company. They're going to have a bad day at work and take that home with them. No, thank you. That's not going to cut it anymore.
It's not. And I don't know if you saw this, but I think it was the Wall Street Journal that had an article about, it was a new McKinsey study that stated that 55% of Gen Z responded that they have either been diagnosed or treated for mental health.
Oh, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
That schools, universities, everybody needs to start taking notice and make the adjustments. So if we think about HR, so we have a lot of HR pros that listen in to Voices of HR. And of course, if I was them, I'd be sitting there asking, okay, so tell me about me. So tell me about what skills do I need to think about, both for me as a CHRO or a director of HR, and also how do I optimize my HR team moving forward to take into account all of this that we just talked about?
Yeah, I would say that in my experience, HR professionals are uniquely positioned to create outsized value in the future of work, because it's not a mechanistic future. We have to acknowledge it's not business people's fault. And this is the side I would represent. when we go to business school, we pound our business leaders with technology and strategy and operations. And we almost act as if people don't play a role in these things. We dehumanize the whole process. But when you get into the world of work, what you know, of course, and you certainly know better than anyone, is that it is all people driven. Even heavy industry, manufacturing, doesn't matter. It's still going to come down to how well your people can contribute, and your people practices will make the difference between high performing companies and lesser performing companies. So I feel like HR professionals are very well positioned. However, I think we've done HR professionals a disservice too. I don't think we've stressed enough the importance of really developing business acumen, of getting business chops to be able to communicate on business terms when it comes to the people part. So too many times you see a weak relationship between an HR business partner, for example, and their business counterpart. And it's almost like they're speaking different languages. The business person is saying, well, you don't add a ton of value to me, so I'm only going to use you when I have to. And the HR business partner is like, I went to school for this. This is what I do. I'm passionate about this. I can help. But I'm going to talk to you about my HR metrics or my HR worldview and not do the translation bit to show you how it actually maps to your business impact. And I think then the two become at loggerheads. Well, it's already a challenge, but now when we shift into economic climate where there's more pressure than ever to be efficient, there's fewer people than ever, we've had tons of reorgs, like everybody's under a tremendous amount of strain. Those two groups, HR and the business, get pulled apart, not pushed together. So HR has a real opportunity, in my opinion, to exercise next level leadership and really meet halfway, and probably have to go a little further than halfway, if I'm being honest, to try to win the business over. And that's why I think, to answer your question about the skills, I think business acumen and that translation bit of connecting and showing how the people practices directly impact the bottom line, not indirect. I don't need time to fill metrics, and I don't need even turnover is such a sort of an indirect measure. Show me how the turnover is affecting the bottom line. Connect those dots for me, right? I think that's where we start to understand better how HR can serve the business. And sometimes I talk to HR professionals who are like, well, it just makes total sense. Well, yeah, if you're as enlightened as you are, it does, but they're not. And it's, we've done this to them. So we don't have to have any judgment. We just have to go further to meet in the middle.
So my key takeaway from that is business acumen, being a participant in the strategy so that you understand the downstream impact, not only to the people, but how it's going to affect your bottom line.
Yeah, definitely. I talked to an HR team the other day and I said, what'd you think of the earnings call, that your company was having? Oh, we didn't listen. Oh, why not? Well, if you don't know what is being talked about on an earnings call, what your company's saying to the street, it's going to be really hard for you to find the leverage to connect the dots all the way to your L&D program or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And I think in today's environment, strategy always comes across as like this very ambiguous, very big thing. And it really isn't. It really isn't. Most companies want to grow. Most companies want to capture more of their market. Most companies want to at least retain their clients, if not grow additional clients. And a lot of times it's not rocket science. You want the same thing for your people, right?
Yeah,
you want to retain
100%.
your people. You want to add good people and you don't want the great ones walking out the door.
Yeah. But I'll give you another a statistic that was sobering to me, which was that 33% of businesses can say that their talent strategy aligns with their business strategy. That is a frightening number, in my opinion. Wow. When you think about the strategy and business strategy, some are good, some are bad, some are clear, some aren't. We get it. But every business has a strategy of some sort that they're executing. But to not have a talent strategy that says, not only have I absorbed the business strategy and I've understood it, but I've created a talent strategy that aligns with it and supports it. What are we doing? We're taking incredible chances and risk. And that's why it creates that artificial divide between the business and HR if we don't create that strategy. So ideally, it would be done in partnership. But again, I'm sorry to the listeners who are in HR, but you'll have to just do a little bit more of that work to connect those dots and earn that respect. And taking an active interest in the business is a good place to start. Yeah.
Yeah. Very well said. Very well said. Any advice then for an up and coming person in HR who needs to develop so many skills? And I guess you could really parlay this to any individual who's maybe manager, senior manager. Would you say the same thing? Business acumen?
I think so. I think that business acumen is a big part of it. But I would say to play the connector role, to really be in the middle, I don't want HR professionals to lose what I love about them the most, which is this intense desire for people to not only
Yeah,
perform well, but to be well. Okay.
right.
That's a very intentional, it's why you're drawn to the field in most cases. And you have a lot of choices of what jobs you might want to take coming out of school. They're like, I'm drawn to people. And so I don't ever want to lose that, but I do want to marry it up. I want to provide equal footing, I would say, equal
Right.
balance between the people part of a business, what really drives the business, and the actual business outcomes itself. So acumen, yes, but I think also that translation ability of showing me how learning and development, coaching, the nurturing, manager relationships, self-awareness, trust, psychological safety. How do these things actually show up in the business? I don't need books. I don't need academia. I don't need, again, HR metrics that are really HR serving. I need to see exactly how these things are playing out in the actual business results, or they're causing a risk for the strategy. If we don't have the capacity, leadership capacity, for example, to drive the future of our business, I need to be able to see that.
Yeah, and I would say, as I'm listening to you, one of the ongoing debates for HR, talk about the divide between sometimes HR and executives, is this ongoing remote work, hybrid work environment. Do you have any data from the Predictive Index or from team optimization whether remote work works or it doesn't?
Yeah, I think the first thing that happened when the pandemic first happened and we sent everyone we could home to be safe, we tried to just simply transport our old practices to the remote world. We did all the exact same things.
Yep.
And that it got us through a little bit. And I think we were probably surprised ourselves as to how productive we could be. The problem is that it's dissatisfactory for everyone involved. It creates a marginalized experience. And I think that one of the challenges is that today, a lot of times when we look at people's personality and we say, well, introverted people love remote work because they don't have to be in office environments where they can't get their
Right.
best work done.
Right.
Like, okay, that might be true, but just because you're an introvert doesn't mean that you don't like people. It's just that
Right.
certain types of social interactions don't really energize you. So people make decisions about their work preferences based on personal choices, not personality choices. And what that means is that if you're a very young person, maybe you live with 3 other roommates in a city center and you can go to the office, no problem. Or maybe if you're an executive and you've made a ton of dough and you can afford to live 10 minutes from the office, you're like, we should all go back to work. I get it. But what about when you're in the middle of your life and you've got young kids to put on the bus? Your compromise and what we're asking you to give up by coming into the office is not equal. And in a world of equanimity, and when we're trying to create sort of personalized work experiences, we're asking a different tax on people when we ask them to come back to the office. So I think being able to be aware of that is that you can't issue a centralized edict and say, we're all going to come back to work on every Tuesday through Thursday. We're being flexible, right? We're letting you stay home 2 days a week. Well, maybe, but I think that the challenge is that there's no silver bullet solution. We've got to work together to find that flexibility. I hear horror stories about, I came in on Monday and I was on Zoom all day. So I sat through the traffic and I missed putting my kid on the bus. And now I'm on Zoom all day and this is dumb. And guess what? I'm going to go find another job. Like that's what's happening in some cases.
Right.
So to me, I think it's really about how do we, whether we're remote, hybrid, or fully on site, always using our people data to be able to make sure we can help people and teams be at their best, offer flexibility where we can, ask for compromise where we can't, but then make them whole in some way, however we can do that. And just don't take for granted that everyone's having the same reaction or experience. It's a pretty poor executive or management team, in my opinion, who says, we're all going to go back to work because I don't trust the work is being done. If you've hired people you can't trust, you have a different problem, and bringing them all to the office, forcing them to come in is not going to solve that. So, it's dissatisfactory and it's not easy. I'm not trying to trivialize it. But I do think understanding how to meet people where they are and find out how can we all do our best work together. That's going to be the right
Absolutely.
mentality to have.
So are there tools? So would the predictive index or other tools help companies optimize their talent in a hybrid work environment? Or is it just the same test, maybe leveraged a little bit differently?
Yeah, when I'm working with clients, for example, I'll put up the entire team on a single view and it'll display them based on personality types. But then I'll color code, for example, these people come into the office every day. These people come in the office every once in a while, and these almost never do. And you start to see, oh my gosh, that makes it so clear now why we're having certain challenges. The type of communication that we typically do in the office is excluding certain people who really need something. So all of a sudden, with that level of awareness about the work format, in addition to the natural personality needs and drivers, then all of a sudden we can have a more advanced way of doing the work, and then one that meets people's needs in a more complex environment. So simple tools can address some pretty complex solutions if we allow them to.
So is it fair to say that you can optimize talent in a hybrid environment?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. There's no doubt that we can get the work done. We have to do it differently. For example, you could take anything we've talked about, building trust, psychological safety. How do you do those things in a hybrid environment? I had a woman that works for me, and she's a highly extroverted person, but for life reasons was fully remote. Well, guess what? I would text her more frequently than I would have otherwise. I would reach out on our communication tools like Slack more frequently than I would have otherwise, because that's what she needed. It wasn't just because, oh, she must be working from home because she doesn't want a lot of personal interaction. No, she made personal choices to work from home, but I need to now modify my behavior as the leader, because it's my job to really make sure that I'm giving people what they need and modifying myself. I might have somebody in the office who's completely introverted. Oh, she must be in the office because she wants to be, me to walk up to her unannounced and just start talking to her all day. No, not at all. Like maybe she can't get her best work done at home, so she comes in the office. Maybe it's more flexibility, or it's a shorter commute. So it's like you have to layer in what you know about people. This is where assessments help, along with the work to be done. Right. So I always ask those three questions. What's the work to be done? Who's doing the work, and who's leading the charge? In this case, when I look at the work to be done and where my people are doing their work, I have to modify my own behaviors, even beyond what I might naturally want for myself, in order to accommodate the complex mix of all those things.
And that is the key to successful hybrid work right there.
Bang.
That's how you optimize. That's our answer. Exclamation point, exclamation point. Okay, so before I let you go and we get into our rapid fire questions, I want to talk about your leadership book. So tell our audience a little bit about why the book, and because you did a ton of work. You interviewed a lot of very successful executives, and it's such a wealth of information. So tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah, the book was born of an experience that I had where I thought I had this leadership thing pretty well figured out. It's a great setup to know that it's about to go horribly wrong. And so after years of military service and 20 plus years leading product teams and studying leadership at the PhD level and just really enjoying studying the craft, I thought things were going great. Then I decided to have a midlife crisis in the middle of a global pandemic. What's the harm in that? Well, the reality was I burned out, Berta. I burned out. Like big time. And I recognized that I just wasn't showing up as the type of leader that I wanted to be. My values had been reprioritized like so many of us had. And I thought I fell out of love with my work, but I had really fallen out of love with myself in many ways. And what I found is that I needed to get back to a strong foundation. And for me, that meant meditation. So I started to sit and resume to practice I had abandoned for more than 15 years. And I stink at meditation. So I'm thinking about work from the cushion.
So do I. So give me some tips.
Oh my gosh.
I would love to be good at it.
Yeah, it's probably one of those things where I'm probably too judgmental. I'm already kind of hurting myself out of the gate. But what happened was, as I sat there and I started using meditation techniques that were, for example, you might wish for happiness for yourself, but can you extend that out to your family? Can you extend that a little further to maybe your coworkers, or maybe even to a stranger out into the universe, or whatever it might be? I thought, man, that's exactly how I've approached my leadership journey. I had to learn to lead myself before I could lead others, before I could lead a team, an organization, or even out into the world now. So that became an interesting thing for me to think about, is how do we create this intersection of Eastern philosophy, the ancient wisdom traditions, but also with Western psychology. I mean, I'm a trained psychologist, come on, and Western leadership approaches. And I come to find out, I believe that we have seen an evolution of the work. We've been talking about hybrid and remote and AI and all these things. We've seen a change in the workers. We've talked about Gen Z. We've talked about what women are experiencing. Has leadership evolved? Has leadership really changed that much? It has not. And I thought, well, how ironic if we need to go back 2,500 plus years to ancient wisdom traditions from the East in order to find our way forward in the West. And that became the motivation for me to answer that question for myself. So I started to do the research and figure out, well, okay, I want to lead myself. What does that entail? What does the psychology research say? And I come to find that certainly not surprising, something like self-awareness. Sure. But what about self-acceptance? Uh-oh. Now the wheels are starting to come off for a lot of leaders. They're like, wait a minute, you have to love those parts of yourself that you're not altogether proud of. You have to incorporate those things into your leadership. And I won't go through the whole framework, but let me just say that every turn I found more and more research and more proof that we can do this. We can absolutely learn how to lead at the next level, but it requires a more human leadership approach. It requires something that's more wisdom-based, in my opinion. It requires an evolution and moving away from outdated attitudes and beliefs about what leadership even is. And that's why I was so proud to interview experts like yourself when it comes to saying, how do we actually teach our HR professionals who are so passionate about bringing leadership into the organization? How do we give them practical tips on how to do that? And your contribution to my chapter for HR leaders was perfect because it was, you had that lived experience of having been in the C-suite with business roles and HR roles. You are the intersection of those two things. I said, well, then let's teach our readers how to do that when they're in those HR roles.
Well, you did. And I am so grateful that you did that because HR sometimes gets left out of those leadership books and they should absolutely be included. So thank you for including us.
Definitely.
All right. Well, and do you have a copy of the book with you?
I do.
Will you hold it up? There we go. So if you're on YouTube, Matt is actually holding up a copy of his book. Thank you. Expand the Circle, available on Amazon. Okay, so we are at the end. Unfortunately, we have this fun part at the end of our podcast called Rapid Fire Questions.
My favorite part.
You love it?
I do. I love rapid fire. I'm a rapid fire guy.
I love it. All right. Well, cool. All right. So 1 sentence questions, 1 sentence answers. Are you ready?
Sure.
Okay. What is the book or books you have given most as a gift and why, and you cannot say your own?
I'm going to go Atomic Habits, James Clear. Changed my life, and I think a lot of people need that kind of help, so I'm happy to recommend it and buy it.
Great book. If you could have a gigantic billboard anywhere with anything on it, metaphorically speaking, getting a message out to millions or billions, what would it say and why?
This too shall pass. One of my favorite ancient wisdom inspired quotes, and it's because everything around us is constantly in flux, and I think we get very attached to stability that's not ours to have. I see so many changes taking place in organizations, and I think it creates a lot of suffering, and I don't like to see that. So I think reminding ourselves that whether something's good, not to be too attached to it, or if something's bad, not to worry that it's going to be around forever. That'd be my billboard. This too shall pass.
Who are some people or experts that you follow and why?
I follow the big ones, all the names that, are very familiar to people, from Brene Brown and Simon Sinek and Adam Grant and everyone like that. But I would say that for my HR professionals in particular, I appreciate that they've recommended to me people like Hiba Youssef from Work Week. And she has a fabulous newsletter, I Hate It Here. Also, Nellie Verlinden, which out of the Association to Innovate HR, which is actually out of Europe. And some really interesting stats, and really helps give me a lens because I'm not in the HR space. It really helps me get a lens into everything that, for better or for worse, that you all are up against. And I just want to be able to help. So those are two people that I count on to give me the real skinny about what it's like and how I can do a better job of being a partner to HR professionals.
That's terrific. What are bad recommendations you hear in your profession or area of expertise?
Just gut it out. Just keep doing the same dumb thing over and over again. There's a lot of bad advice that leaders are given. I think this notion that we have to be hard and soft skills have no place, or if we're soft with our people, they'll walk all over us. Boy, it's terrible advice. It's just it feels bad to give it. We talked about Gen Z earlier. I had a Gen Z leader who was like, I'm now having to make decisions about who to lay off in my company. And it's really messing with my values, because I'm all about kindness and I'm all about, service to others. And now here I'm in this unwinnable position because I want to do a good job, but I also I'm struggling. Like you can't use these old ways and approaches and expect them to work in today's frame. No way. So that's bad advice.
Speaking of advice, what advice would you give someone just starting out in HR?
I would say definitely to build a bridge. See yourself as a bridge builder, and to figure out everything from negotiation to interpersonal relationships, but always with an eye towards translating the things that you naturally are drawn to and love, and framing them within the other person's context. Skills like active listening, being able to have empathetic statements, trying to really take an active interest, a consulting mindset. These are the types of things I would say to somebody coming in. Don't think that you can just master your HR craft and only go to your HR schools and expect to win. No, you've got to really bring that consultant capability to ask questions, put problems on the table, and recommend solutions that are going to produce real business results.
What move did you make that had the biggest positive impact on your career?
I think when I walked away from a career as a software product person for more than 20 years, which I loved it. But I think becoming a consultant and working on the implementation of people practices, in my case, my specialty is Fortune 500 and federal government, very large, complex situations. It really unlocked for me and got me back to my roots of wanting to help people in a hands-on way. So it was a challenging move for me. You lose a piece of your identity, but that was definitely a move that I'm very happy with.
Yeah, those are tough. Well, today we have been joined by Dr. Matt Poepsel, Vice President at the Predictive Index. Thank you again, Matt, for joining me. It has been such a pleasure.
Berta, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. My best to your audience. Absolutely.
Of course. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks so much for watching. We would love it if you shared your thoughts on any of the topics we discussed in the comments below. And if you got value from the video, it would mean the world to us if you hit the like button and subscribe to the HRMorning channel. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Voices of HR.